Stop. Please don't go by it. We're probably have it.
Please do.
Call the meeting to order of the Unified Development Ordinance Review. So, where do we go?
Well, I'm going to have Tim talk real quick, but just to let everybody know, I know council knows this. This is just to review Planning Commission's recommendations, review all the UDO that's been proposed, and answer any questions that council has. A few questions have been presented to us over the last month. So Lisa's got a presentation here to try to cover those, and then any additional ones that council has, just to make everybody comfortable to proceed to a first reading. And then Tim's just going to do a quick explanation.
Thank you, Matt. Council, we're here to deliberate over this, and you have the opportunity to consider all the record that is before you based upon the public hearing, the other evidence that's been properly brought before you. What I would say that if there's been any ex parte type communication outside, which I'm not aware of, I've not heard of any, but if so, I ask that you not consider that, and that you base your decision purely on the record that's before you, including primarily the information brought to you through the Planning Commission's public hearing. Okay? Thank you.
Take it away.
So good evening. Thank you for having a great thing out here this evening. As you know, I always view this as a conversation and not a one-way talking at you through this presentation. So please feel free to interrupt at any point through this.
Can I interrupt real quick? I'm sorry. Yeah. And along the lines of that conversation I had with you, I also want to make it clear there will not be public comment during this portion. That would be additional to the record that's been established. So that's why we're going to go through the presentation and then just consider the rest of the evidence properly reviewed.
So as Matt said, we will review the text revisions to the Unified Development Ordinance, or the UDO, that was recommended by the Planning Commission, as well as several other topics of interest, and then we'll end with next steps. So on October 1st, the Planning Commission held a required public hearing for the comprehensive update to the zoning and subdivision ordinances. And on October 16th, the Planning Commission met and recommended approval of the Unified Development Ordinance, which is dated August 28th, 2024, with the accompanying zoning map, which is dated August 22nd, 2024. The Planning Commission did recommend several revisions to the text of the UDO, which I'll review throughout the course of this project presentation, and we will provide the text for those recommended revisions. In the definitions section, the Planning Commission recommended adding to the definition of a carport a requirement that carports have a permanent foundation. This revision was to prevent temporary carports like you see on the screen, since these canvas carports lack a permanent foundation. As you know, to better control the placement of homes, the UDO mandates a maximum front setback in the R1B and the R1C districts, which will prevent homes from being located too far back on the lot and disrupting the line of homes along the street. The Planning Commission recommended revising this requirement so that homes on flag lots would not be subject to the maximum front setback requirement. And if you're wondering what a flag lot is, what you see on the screen is a lot with limited frontage along the street, and then the lot widens at the back like you see. It is called a flag lot because the unusual shape of the lot resembles a flag attached to a pole. Since principal dwellings on flag lots do not interrupt the established line of homes on the street, the Planning Commission felt the requirement for a maximum front setback was not appropriate for flag lots. Any discussion, questions about those few revisions to the UDO that the Planning Commission recommended?
Are carports allowed behind houses at all, like if they're USBs?
So they are an accessory structure, and depending upon the district that they're in, they are allowed.
They have to be permanent, is what you're saying?
Correct. As I understand it, there are some questions about the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District. Overlay districts are a type of special district established to provide for specific additional requirements and are applied on top of the regulations in the applicable zoning district, as the graphics shown on the screen. The Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District is a zoning overlay district, as I said, and it's dedicated to the protection of traditional development patterns and neighborhood character along Fort Thomas Avenue. And the regulations promote the continuity of the existing built environment and seek to reduce conflict between new construction and the existing development as it relates to single-family and two-family development. The boundaries of the overlay district are shown on the zoning map with blue hash marks, which is why you see them on the screen. The overlay district starts on the northern portion of the city at Covert Run and goes down to Waterworks Road. The district then proceeds from Waterworks Road down to the town center. Because this overlay district only applies to residential properties, the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District skips downtown and resumes at St. Nicholas Place to the Midway area. From Midway, the overlay district ends at Alexandria Pike. This district applies to parcels occupied by single-family detached dwellings, two-family dwellings, and residential care facilities for persons with disabilities. Therefore, if a parcel is zoned R3, which is your multifamily district, one of them, and it is currently occupied by a multifamily dwelling, then the parcel would not be subject to the regulations in the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District, but is subject to additional standards that we will discuss in a few minutes. And the Planning Commission did make recommendations to add additional ones as well that we will discuss. Only some modifications to residential properties will be subject to these regulations. All new construction and substantial additions. In this case, substantial additions mean any alteration or modification to the facade of a residential property facing Fort Thomas Avenue, other than routine maintenance. So painting your house, those kinds of things would not be subject to the regulations in the district. And then compliance to these standards is evaluated by the zoning administrator unless there's a deviation requested, in which case it's heard by the design review board. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. I apologize.
I can't read that, anyways, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Okay. You're like me. Yeah. Because the district applies to single-family and two-family dwellings, the regulations are tailored to those types of dwellings. The overlay district regulations include tight regulation of the front setback for the principal dwelling unit and regulations for the placement of detached and unattached garages, freestanding carports, roof design, building orientation, prohibition against enclosing your front porch, facade design, including requiring windows on the facade facing Fort Thomas Avenue, and the placement of solar panels. The Planning Commission did recommend one change to the Fort Thomas Avenue Overlay District.
Regulations because of that. But that might be, again, we've got great people within this city. And so many people want to do the right thing, and sometimes they go at it and they just make a mistake and somebody says, oh, that looks awful. I would love the opportunity to be able to go to the design review board and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking of. What do you all think? And get feedback from them. And I know it's volunteers that are in the design review board, so they're volunteering their time. I would think they would be willing to do that for someone who wanted to do changes to their house.
I agree.
We might be able to have maybe a blend of that where I don't think anybody wants homes right up on the avenue. And I don't know that people want to see solar panels as you go down the avenue. So maybe some of those things are in an overlay that restricts them, but then there's other pieces of it that you're suggesting.
And it would be nice to hear back from Mayor Halston.
So maybe new construction as well. Maybe that stays in. I don't know. That's good idea, Eric. Is that maybe there's some of it that we keep, but the rest is just voluntary.
I think this just proves the point that we should probably take this part out so we can have further discussion
Is any council opposed to removing it and discussing it more in depth later on?
But I like to hear more from, I think we can get the institute a little bit more feedback for what really affects, see what they're thinking too as well.
So what we will do then, if this is how this ultimately plays out tonight, is between your first reading and your second reading, we will provide to you a new map that shows that the overlay district gone, and then
It would depend, like, for example, at an existing complex, you can't change the entrance driveway into the complex, but we're looking at a four-family on the avenue, you wouldn't want that kind of 4 or 6 family on another street turn, but we have, like, for example, Gettysburg or Enfield or Ridgewood, you can't face all, the building right in front of the entrance, you won't have entrance.
right,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So, but in a case where you have a 4 to 6 family on the street and it doesn't have its own street going in, I think it's attractive.
And we certainly can make that change, but my question to you is, on those, it's most important on the avenue.
Yeah.
I think it really is, because if, for example, if those buildings were torn down and what I described happened, that would greatly change the character of the avenue.
Yeah.
Is it as important in other places?
I would say it is, I mean, to me, if you're driving down a residential street and there's a 4 family, you wouldn't want it rebuilt with the side of the building facing the street. You'd still want it with the front facade facing the.
So how does that not prevent a problem for, say, immigrants?
Well, the buildings aren't, none of them are facing the street.
So it doesn't matter.
It's a driveway.
Right, so it really
So
doesn't.
it's its own road, I guess.
I'm gonna have to figure it out. Let's just be honest about it.
Did you see my concern about?
I do, and we may be able, and I'll figure something out. I'm gonna look at the dynamics of those lots. I'm sorry.
The size of those lots.
It could be the size of the lots, it could be any number of things that we can, because what I'm going to be looking for truthfully is an objective standard. Whether it's, like you said, the size of the lots or any number of other things that I could come up with that would be objective, so that whomever is administering this ordinance would say, in this situation, those standards are appropriate, they are required, but in that situation, they are not.
It might be something as simple as a complex, an apartment complex, that, like Andy said, that is a separate road or a driveway in, and separate buildings.
Another problem you
Defined
have
by the number of units.
Or it could be defined by the number of buildings, right? Because what we're really talking about.
That would make sense, because
Yeah.
it's the U-shaped complex across from the sandwich place at Highland Plaza,
Oh, right, yes.
and the U-shaped complex down past the post office next to, those, if one of those tears down, you can't turn it, you're covering up another building. So it has to, you're still gonna look at the edge of the building.
Right, right.
Yeah, right.
But if it's a 4-family right on the street, like where Thomas, when she makes a bend, before you get to where Grandview, all of those buildings, none of those should be turned on their side if they're rebuilt.
Right, right. Okay. I think I can come up with an objective standard that works. So for example, we would exclude courtyard buildings, which is what you're talking about with your shape buildings.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. Okay.
So then would that exclude, like that 4-family you were just showing, if they have enough property, what if that came, what if it caught fire and had to be demolished? Could you, and they met the density requirements to add units, could they not add a courtyard? Could you include the possibility of a courtyard if the property meets the standards for density?
Do you want to allow that?
I just thought of it,
But the other standard we can use is lot width, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if the lot width is X, then this works. If it's wide, then it doesn't.
I just,
I don't want to add any more units to the building, though. They'd have to build the same amount of units.
Well, they will. I mean, the density standard's going to be the same.
Okay.
But we're not, and the density standard shouldn't change. I'm sorry?
yeah, the density would be the same.
The density would be the same, right?
I don't think those courtyard buildings are good. They're not bad looking, so.
I don't think so. I think the courtyard's been fine.
So the planning commission also recommended including regulations for multifamily dwellings with frontage on the avenue that parallels those for the single family and two family in the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay district. These new regulations prohibit street facing garages or garage entrances unless the entrance is no wider than 12 feet. And then side loaded and rear loaded garages and garage entrances are permissible. And the planning commission also recommended regulations for multifamily dwellings with frontage on the avenue that governs carports, portico share, and solar energy systems. And then the regulation would also prohibit the enclosing of porches that exist on these buildings, on these multifamily buildings that face Fort Thomas Avenue. So the question before you is, now that we have gotten rid of the overlay district, do we want to include these other standards?
I think we address it at the same time we address the overlay. Because if we're going to do an overlay, we want, if we do any type at all, even a minimal, we need to make sure that people are under that same umbrella. Same will, but we're going to address it later. That's my thought. Makes sense. Yeah.
All right, so what I heard y'all saying is that you would not move forward with those and you would consider them at the time that you look at the overlay. Okay, got it. So we've also heard that there are some concerns regarding the entire Park Historic Overlay District and those concerns were also raised during the public hearing. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. And Wes, if I misstate anything, just scream at me, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are 3 residential historic areas within Tower Park. The proposed Tower Park Historic Overlay District creates this local historic district for those historic homes in Tower Park. The overlay district regulates exterior alterations if the alteration is visible from a public or private right-of-way and public property. And I'm emphasizing that so that you understand that, like, unlike in the Central Business District Historic District, where you're only regulating the fronts of buildings as they face the avenue or the side of the building if they face Miller or whatever. Basically, many of these homes are going to be regulated in terms of the exterior alteration on all sides because of the nature of the park. So that is different for this district. The Design Review Board will review these exterior changes. Today, the exterior alterations to these historic homes are regulated differently depending upon the location of the home within Tower Park. For the homes on Green and Pearson Streets, as we understand it, when the homes on Green and Pearson were originally conveyed to the homeowners in '92, the city created a codes, covenants, and restrictions, which is a deed restriction, requiring that the exterior renovation be approved by the city, who is named as the developer in the declaration, within 60 days of the submittal. The original declaration stated, and I'm just going to read it to you word for word, owners shall repair, maintain, and use the units in a manner which will preserve and protect and be consistent with the historic and the architectural features of the exterior of these buildings. And then in 1992, one declaration covered both Pearson and Green Streets. In 2004, 2 separate homeowners associations were created, one for Pearson and one for Green. The declaration for Pearson Street still names the city as the developer and says, again, I'm going to read it to you, in recognition of the historical value of these properties, members of the association agree to maintain the exterior decor of each unit in accordance with the guidelines provided by the Kentucky Heritage Council and the National Park Service Historic Preservation Guidelines. What was probably meant by that long statement was that they had to qualify with the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, because there are no guidelines provided by the Kentucky Heritage Council. So that, I think that's what was meant, was the Secretary of Interior standards. All right, so now we're going to move back to Cochran Avenue and Alexander Circle. When the city orchestrated the disposition of the homes on these two streets, the city amended Chapter 36 of the city's Code of Ordinances to require the alterations to be reviewed based on the Fort Thomas VA Homes Architectural Guidelines, and it was clear the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. Because the amendment to Chapter 36 was made, the Design Review Board, not city staff, review exterior alterations to the homes on Cochran Avenue and Alexander Circle and issues a COA when they think it's appropriate. So to recap, the city administration reviews exterior alterations today for the homes on Green and Pearson, and the Design Review Board reviews alterations to the homes on Cochran and Alexander Circle. So to bring consistency to these review processes, the Tower Park Historic Overlay District was proposed. Wes, do you want to add anything to that?
No, based on what you said and the assumptions made of what they were referring to the Secretary of Interior standards, I agree. Reading both of that for the HOA documents, Pearson and Green Street, it's clear that they were referring to the National Park Service Secretary of Interior standards.
So basically, all three are the same. It's just they're different. Staff does two, and Design Review Board does the other.
Kind of. The other difference is that when the city took on the homes on Alexander Circle and Cochran Avenue, there were these very detailed design guidelines that were put in place.
Okay.
And that's not changing.
Okay.
So that is in Chapter 36 today, and that will continue. If you decide to institute this overlay district, that will continue to be the case.
So the overlay really won't have any effect on that.
It really won't.
So we're not changing any of the standards that they have to abide by. It's just the city is now, whether it's administrative or design review board, is now an overlay looking at what they're doing and approving.
So essentially, yes. However, I say that just because we are expressly saying through this overlay district that they have to comply with Secretary of Interior standards. That is, while that is not word for word within the existing CCNRs, both Wes and I believe that's what was meant. So the standards by which they are being reviewed are not changing, but who is reviewing them is.
So they said they would before, but they really didn't have to because no one was really looking at it, didn't have any teeth. Essentially now, it's all looked at by the, right.
Essentially, yes, but I
If they
wouldn't put
didn't
it
do
that way. Yeah. So we heard through the public hearing that there were some homeowners on Green Street who did not want to be included in the Tower Park Historic District. When the Planning Commission made their recommendation on the UDO on October 16th, they basically considered that they wanted to continue to include Green Street in the Tower Park Historic District. Any other questions or considerations about the overlay district for Tower Park?
If the Design Review Board is overseeing this, are they allowed to offer any waivers or exemptions or anything like that to these standards?
So again, let's think about the Design Review Board wearing two hats. And so right now, what they are wearing the hat in this situation of the Design Review Board that issues certificates of appropriateness to the design guidelines that they are required to use. And those are the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation or the standards that were put in place for the VA homes along Alexander Circle and Alexander Circle and Cochran Avenue. So they always today and in the future will interpret what those standards mean. If you understand what I'm saying.
So, yeah.
So the reality is, all of it could be handled by staff if you're going by the interior standards. However, if you use the Design Review Board, you got a group of people that might interpret something a little bit different.
So these are not, when Councilmember Ellison, we were talking about the R3 properties, I made this statement. We need to find an objective way to have these standards apply. All the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation are subjective. And because of their subjectivity, they're always going to be interpreted by the people who are making those reviews. Now, the city has hired Wes, which will help lend consistency. But again, they are reviewing against a set of subjective standards, not objective ones. Wes, would you like to?
The Secretary of Interior standards are pretty clear on what is allowable. They read sometimes as subjective because they are meant to cover a wide array of historic buildings from different eras, different areas, different architectural styles. But when read with the lens of not only applying the Secretary of Interior standards of rehabilitation, but also using the bulletins that are issued by the Park Service that describe how each individual update or maintenance should be applied, it's pretty clear in most cases what is supposed to be done. So they're really not as subjective. Sometimes the language can be read that way, but when looked at through a preservation mindset of applying them in an effort to preserve the historic integrity of the building, they're very clear. So there really isn't much subjectivity involved. It's just a matter of looking at which standards apply to each certificate of appropriateness application, and then finding the relevant language in the interior standards, but also finding the relevant bulletins that the Park Service issues to determine how these alterations and rehab projects and things should take place.
I'm just thinking about your role in that. So if there's, even though it is maybe more objective than it appears, the DRB could still grant a waiver for some aspect of it, it sounds like is what you said. And so what is your role in advising them on it? How does that work?
Currently, my role is to review the COA, the applications, apply the standards, and provide my recommendations as a preservation expert. And then the design review board takes my recommendations and makes their decisions.
But there is nothing in the UDO that specifically gives the design review board the authority to grant a waiver to any of the Secretary of Interior standards or the standards that are applicable in Alexander Circle. There is literally nothing in the UDO that does that.
That's what I was getting ready to say. My understanding, they can't give a waiver. What they're doing is interpreting, and in their interpretation, they feel like a waiver to somebody, but they can't give a waiver.
So the recommendation of planning and zoning is to have the overlay.
It is, and to include Green Street in it.
And I know that there was a lot of back and forth between the people that lived on it. What's the latest on that? Did they come to an agreement with what they're interested in? Or?
You mean a dissolve an HOA?
Yeah.
We're having a meeting next month on that. That I've been invited to.
Can council change any of those standards at any point?
As it's currently drafted, we are using the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, and that is historically what has happened within Tyler Park. But those are promulgated not by the city, but by the Secretary of Interior. Wes, do you want to add to
I mean,
that?
I'm just, like, for instance, say, at some point, we said, I'm just making this up, so please don't take it as like, hey, they could use, like, instead of wood, they could use a vinyl for the window or something. Could we ever say we want to allow this to happen?
So, in addition to the Secretary of Interior standards, while the Kentucky Heritage Council, which is the Kentucky SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, while they follow the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation on like tax credit projects and other regulatory projects, with the ongoing technology and materials changing every year. Each year, the Heritage Council kind of revamps what they allow in their tax credit projects, their preservation projects, things that they deem to be historically accurate enough to include on projects like that. In cases where there are questions on, this material may not fall directly in the Secretary of Interior standards, it's not uncommon to also review standards, guidelines, and precedents set forth by the Heritage Council, who regulate Kentucky specifically on, are these materials historically appropriate? How do they affect the building as a whole, not only the visual character, the aesthetic character of the building or the architectural character, but also the overall longevity of the building and then the ability to keep these buildings preserved. So while the Secretary of Interior standards is pretty clear on what is allowed, obviously they're not reissuing these standards every year. And the Heritage Council does, and you said windows, that's always a big one because it's a big cost. As new technology and windows come out, the Heritage Council has changed their opinion on what they allow in certain historic buildings. In those cases, there could be a case made for why that would meet the Secretary, because ultimately that's who Kentucky Heritage Council is beholden to, or the Secretary of Interior standards, and they interpret them in a way that works within their system. And if an argument can be made that this is appropriate, Kentucky Heritage Council has allowed this in the past, they deem it that this falls within the Secretary of Interior standards, then that would be another avenue that I would use in my recommendations of why this does fall. While it doesn't necessarily read to be specific to the Secretary of Interior standards, it does fall within relevant preservation practices.
That makes sense. It's like using engineered wood rather than pure wood on some kind of part of the house. That might be an example of where they say, okay, that works okay.
Exactly. I mean, the Secretary of Interior standards are written to cover broad ideas of preservation practices. They can't write them to cover every single issue that might come up. The local SHPOs, local state historic preservation offices, are there to provide guidance on more localized issues. But obviously, as technology advances, new products are out there, and I'm constantly learning about them just in my field, going to different conferences and things, and you see these new materials being used. So I think that answers your question, right?
No, it doesn't. It's a very great explanation, but I just simply want to know, if we don't like it, can we change it? What I'm gathering is, if we don't like it and say we want them to use artificial, we won't allow them to use vinyl. And how does that affect? Can we actually say, hey, look, we love all your standards except this one. We want to line item it, and we want to allow them to use vinyl windows. I'm not saying that's what we would do, but could we change it, and how would that affect the overall preservation? Does it kick them out of the window to be able to get any tax credits or money back? Can we personally change those rules? Basically you give us guidelines. Are we allowed to adjust those guidelines?
Well, if we're talking about if they'd be able to apply for tax credits using altered guidelines by Fort Thomas, no.
Okay. But could we alter those guidelines if we wanted to?
I think that's a slippery slope, personally. The legality of it, I don't think that the Secretary of Interior standards should be altered. I think they are the baseline for preservation practices. They are the go-to nationwide baseline for what is appropriate.
I get that.
Yeah.
That's not, Jim, I guess.
And I think the answer is you can.
Okay.
I don't think it makes sense.
I'm just, okay. I just thought maybe there was something, when I talk to people on Green Street, and I talk to the other ones, and obviously, there's a little bit of indifference on them, and what I kept telling them was like, come to us with something. I said, I want the city to have an overview here. I want them to be the ones in charge. I don't believe that they're self-policing now, some of them are, and there's bickering between all of them, and I just want it to stop, you know what I mean? And I think it's arguably the most important part of our city. Right now, it's our heritage, it's history, it's Tower Park. It's why we're here, right, So I kept saying to them, come to us with a set of standards that you like, you know what I mean, that would protect it. And so far, this is the best option to start, and I don't want to take that away from them, but I just didn't know at some point if we started here and they work back.
I've got an answer for you. First of all, it's your UDO. You put in your UDO what you want.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes. Doesn't make sense, I think, to do anything but the overlay with the standards we're using. Now, I can tell you that there have been residents who have come forward and said, hey, going forward, would it make sense to go ahead and collaborate with the city? I think Newport went further and it had regulations built in that were a little more fine-tuned even, and is that something that can happen down the road? Yes. But right now, this certainly appears from my seat to be a very good start. And
I think it's a great start. I just was looking for other things. I mean, I was just, trying to protect it and still give people some rights, but just talking.
So if the design review board is only evaluating, who makes the decision on?
The design review board,
Yeah.
they issue the certificate of appropriateness.
Okay.
Correct. Okay, let me back up for that. If you choose to go forward with the overlay district, they would be the authority that would be reviewing it and then issuing the COA with Wes's advice.
Correct.
And that is the recommendation of the planning commission.
Yes, sir, it is. Should we move on, or are there additional questions? So during the update process, we've heard extended conversations about murals, both with you and the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission recommended removing murals from the UDO. In the August 28th version of the UDO, murals are only permitted in the Central Business District as a conditional accessory use only after approval by the Design Review Board and the Board of Adjustment. And the reason that is because the Board of Adjustment reviews all conditional uses. And because it's in the local historic district, it has to go to the Design Review Board. So we'll spend just a minute telling you what the standards are for murals as it's currently drafted in the UDO. The design, construction, installation, repair, and maintenance of such displays must not interfere with traffic or pedestrian safety. No part of the mural shall extend the height or width of the building. No part of the mural may extend more than 6 inches from the plane of the wall to which it's affixed. No part of the mural should project above the roof line unless the Design Review Board says it's okay. A mural shall not be installed on any original facade of a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, unless that mural can be removed without harming the building. There can be no electrical or mechanical components or changing images. All murals are prohibited on the front facade of the building, and they can't be placed over windows, doors, vents, those kinds of things.
So their recommendation is just to get rid of the murals completely.
Just to get rid of it all.
And we had a long conversation.
We did.
Both groups about this, and we went both ways on it. So I defer to their recommendation. Just take it out.
Just to kind of speed this up, this is the other topic that I've had a couple council members come and just discuss with me that they think it's also best just to remove, and we can talk about it in the future if we want to add it, but maybe discuss a little bit more about how we can regulate it if possible and things like that. So just to kind of throw that out there to get the conversation started. If we want to talk about this anymore, or if it is something like the overlay we want to talk about in the future, we can just talk about that aspect of it and kind of create something in the future. So I'm not sure what council's.
So I'm just curious, just to be clear, not what's proposed, but currently, you cannot do?
So right now, the current
Is it
zoning
silent on it?
is silent. And what would happen if we do this is it would continue to be silent. There would be no standards. The UDO would not address murals at all.
So what they're recommending no though, like no murals at all, right?
Well, the Planning Commission specifically said, just remove it completely. They gave no direction as to whether to prohibit them, or they just said, take it out. So given that, the existing zoning ordinance is silent, the UDO would be silent as well.
Removing this might be worse because being silent, because we already have some, and someone comes along and does something, we lose any sort of voice and when we go there, even though we can't limit, regulate content. So, I mean, if we don't want it, we would, I think is what you're saying, we would specifically have to prohibit it.
So I'm going to defer to Tim as to whether or not how we should move forward in terms of a prohibition.
It was a little surprising to me how polarizing murals truly work. No opinion on it, other than I will tell you that I'll defend no matter what happens. we'll be ready to go litigate whether we've got something in there discussing conditions and restrictions, or if it's just wide open. We'll be ready to go, and we'll go defend what we've got to defend. But I hear what you're saying, and that was my comment at the last time this body discussed murals, and my point was, hey, if I've got to be able to argue it, it wouldn't be bad to have some set of guidelines and restrictions, and you've got some control over it. But it's up to you.
Or you can just prohibit it, pretty black and white.
And then
That's how
I
I
thought it was to be pulled up in the language.
we're gonna go fight over it.
I think we prohibit it, and if we want to revisit it when someone comes to us with a mural idea, then we can address it at that time. But I think it's easier just to
To
say no.
specifically prohibit?
Specifically.
I mean, just, you had said we have multiple murals, we only have one that I'm aware of that's on a public, or on a private building, correct? Am I wrong on that?
Where is that?
This is not us.
That's not all, it's just a picture.
So, Tim, do you think it's better to be silent on it or to specifically prohibit it? Because right now it's been working.
I think
Right.
we specifically prohibit it. We're picking a fight. Somebody is just gonna hear about it, this nice lady's gonna write about it, and somebody's gonna go, somebody's gonna.
Yeah, she's ready.
fight.
Tim said.
I could see the village players wanting to do something. They may add an addition on the back of their building that faces the parking lot. I could see them wanting to do some kind of creative theater kind of thing on the back of their building. I don't know, they might, but I thought what planning and zoning recommended was to prohibit. If you're just saying they take it out, then
They specifically said just take it out, but they did not keep in mind that this was at the end of a very long meeting.
I get it.
That's a
The,
fact.
They didn't say to prohibit it, they just said take it out.
They just said take it out.
just like it is.
When we were discussing it with them back and forth, and they were on this side, for the most part, they were adamant no on it in general. They were no at first. We brought it back up. I personally, I was a part of that when I was in town. I think it's lovely. It does make me nervous with today's climate, people's expressions, and the good they think they're doing, and they're actually not. They're doing the opposite with their statements. And I would prefer just to prohibit it for now, and then if someone wants to pick a fight, that's what you're for, Tim. And if we feel that this is something that we can, and you're good at it. You got some initials on your cufflinks for a reason, right? You know what I mean? Lots of battles. And I just think I think it's better just to prohibit it, say no to it, and then when someone does want to do something, we can attack it then. And if someone comes with something, maybe we do it. I mean, I know the Village Players wants to do one. It's in the $3 million ad campaign for Thomas Icon at the Cultural Arts Center. So I know they want to do it. It's in here. I get that, but.
And if you decide to, if you decided you wanted to put something in that allowed but regulated, the only thing you can regulate it in any reasonable manner other than content.
So I just said no for now.
Just for clarity purposes, I know we have at least one mural in town, and we've been silent on the issue, and the recommendations to stay silent. I'm not suggesting that that's what we should do. I think it's a good conversation to discuss whether we prohibit or just be silent. What's the standard operating procedure now when we're silent and somebody has an application or comes to the city and wants to design a mural? How does that work?
We would deny it and say it's not allowed. Because it's not prohibited, permitted. I'm sorry.
And then they just do it?
I mean, I think we probably have teeth to find somebody for that. But what that would do is if they would bring it to us and we would tell them that, I mean, this is kind of how a change would happen, is they would bring it to us and say, hey, we want to do this, we can say you can't, and they'll say, well, we really want to, and then we can kind of bring that up to council, and that's what I'm telling them, like, look, if you really want to do this, we can bring it up to council, see what their opinion is, to see if it's allowed, and that's kind of how a lot of zoning changes or ordinance changes for that matter occur.
So Tim, if they comes now and they say they want to do a mural, we say no, they might go ahead and do it, but if we specifically have it prohibited, aren't we in a stronger position?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. And I think there's not a lot of law out there right now on murals in Commonwealth and you know, what the courts will do with it. You know, I think that if the city's position is we're gonna prohibit it, I have no problem putting it in writing and we'll go deal with it.
It seems like that would give us at least a seat at the table where we could say we have a law against this, but if it's getting kind of sticky, yes, but, and we have some say versus no.
I
And they
don't
give us
disagree.
The last one we did was done through the city Renaissance Board. So that's a little different too.
So does anybody disagree with prohibiting it then?
I'm with you. I'm totally fine. I agree.
If we do that, the only thing I'd ask from the city, I'd be curious, I think council would be well informed to know what kind of interest there is down the road for murals. You know, the volume of requests we do or don't get. Because that's one thing I don't know. I don't know how many, I have no, you know, I hear people in favor and people opposed to the murals, but I don't have any good feel for how many actual, you know, plans or proposals there are.
Yeah, since I've been here, have you had any?
In my tenure, I had one request. I've been here about just shy of 10 years, and I've had one request, and at the time I denied, and I asked them, come up with some language, come to a council at the time, and they didn't do that.
We actually had a second one. We did do one behind the building, didn't they? Hang one on the
Yeah, on property.
Could you not, I didn't hear the answer, but you can't prohibit it with language in there saying unless approved by the design review board or Renaissance board or anything.
You can't, what I'm saying is you can't regulate the content. If they want to
Even at that
say
point,
something
they
foul.
can approve it, they can still do it at it.
But just to kind of answer your question, if moving forward, that would be definitely something I would bring to council every time we get one, just because I know it's a topic here, especially if we deny them, just so you will be aware. And that goes really along with any ordinance. If we start getting kind of pushback on certain things that we've done, I'll be sending that out to council and just say, hey, look, we did this. This is how we voted, and this is what I'm hearing, just to see if council's interested in reconsidering it. So that'll definitely be the next 6 to 12 months while we're working through, you know, applying this. I'll be sending out emails to council just saying, hey, these are some issues that came up, and then, like I told you before, you know, 6-9 months from now, expect us to come to council for a kind of a overhaul and say, you know, hey, these couple things that we'd like to get tweaked, that they aren't working out or something like that. I mean, it's pretty typical of every ordinance change for zoning.
I think the problem is too, once you allow one though, it opens up the door for more. You know, after we say no and then they come and even though we believe it's in good taste, you know, the more you allow, the slipperier slope that is, it gets steeper and harder to defend the content that's on there. So I think it's a no, just in general. You know, I love to hear about it, but unfortunately, I just don't trust everyone to do the right thing.
It was interesting, Matt, your take on what, if we're silent, is that your answer to them is no because it's not specifically allowed. How is that different from prohibition? Legal?
I think if somebody comes, it's an interesting question, but I think if somebody comes and they say, this is not prohibited in any manner, and at least I don't think it's going to be something where it would be like a conditional use anywhere at some point. I think if you just were silent on it, it would make it a little easier for somebody to argue, hey, I think we should be permitted to put it out there, and the city's being arbitrary in deciding what to do and when to do it. It is the only one that's up right now on government property.
There's one on the bicentennial, right? Bicentennial.
The Tribal Advisory Building, right?
Correct. And then just the one on our parking lot. That's our property.
And our property is exempt from zoning, so I'm not worried about that. If we've got one that's on private property, certainly at that point, somebody could come and say, wait, you're silent on whether or not I can have this mural. You've got one over there. Why am I being treated different? I think if the path you're going to go is, hey, we don't want murals, then say it and I'll go fight it.
Yes, if we don't prohibit it, I mean, what's to stop somebody from just putting one up without coming to the city to be denied? I mean, if I felt like getting up on a Saturday morning and painting a giraffe on my building, I can just do that because nowhere says that I can't do that.
Kevin, that's a good question for you. I assume you would look at it and go, well,
I mean, my interpretation, it'd be no different than somebody building a shed or building something else. You know, we have, something that regulates that. My interpretation in the past was that if it was, as it was presented to me, I said no at that point in time. They could certainly go to the Board of Adjustment and challenge my decision. That's one of the conditions that the Board of Adjustment can do. So they could challenge that decision. At that point, we'd be bringing it to them probably and getting, legal advice in that regard. But they could challenge my decision if I said no.
One of my concerns about this is that our cultural arts district, village players, the whole back of the theater, the old theater building, that faces on our parking lot though. Does that give us some options? We own the parking lot and that's where it's seen that we could allow murals on the back of those buildings.
I'd have to think about it. I mean, it's still private property, but it is.
Right, it's viewed from a public lot.
Public.
I mean, that's the only place I would think that anybody would be interested in doing it is because it's art, or whether they hung artwork on the building, and that was in your description a little bit, that it could be hung as long as it didn't destroy the building, that, I don't know, yeah.
I say we just do no, and if they want one, they can come apply.
Deal with it later. Deal with it later, yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you would like to expressly prohibit, define it and prohibit it. Is that correct?
I think it puts us in the best possible position to not get something we don't want, and then we can.
If you keep it simple and just say no murals, don't describe it, then we can make it be.
We have to define it.
It's a mural. We define it.
If you want to define it, bring it back to us, you know what, right?
So what will happen, as I said, between now and the second reading is you will get this text.
Okay.
So we can look at it then.
Yeah, and Tim can wordsmith if he has to.
Lisa's really good at it. I just tinkered.
And I'm thankful for the tinkering. All right, can we move on?
Yes.
Okay. So as I understand it, there are some questions regarding the authority for boards and commissions and one staff person under the UDO. I will review some of the powers and duties under the UDO for several of the boards and commissions. So the zoning administrator administers and enforces the Unified Development Ordinance. In the UDO, we retain the zoning administrator's existing powers and duties, which are currently spread all the way through the zoning ordinance, and listed them all, gathered them in one place and listed them in section 1.3. There are two new powers and duties included in the UDO. The first is to expressly authorize the zoning administrator to determine that an unlisted use is similar to the uses listed in the code. The zoning administrator does that today. But what the UDO does is give specific authority to do so and criteria by which to judge the proposed use. The zoning administrator is also given the authority to hear and decide on administrative modifications to some zoning standards if he is presented that it is an unintended error or a unique situation. The zoning administrator is permitted to deviate by no more than 10% of a numerical standard, except for maximum permitted height. And when we met here back in the summer, y'all said no more than 5% for the maximum permitted height. The zoning administrator also issues certificates of zoning compliance, which is new under the UDO, and approves small cell systems. And the approval of a small cell system is something that is governed by the federal government and we have no control over.
Real quickly, does Wes need to be here anymore? Do we pay him by the hour? We're not talking about historical stuff anymore. I mean,
Does anybody have any other historical concerns?
Unless he's on retainer, then we just use other time. I'll take the water, Wes.
The council's okay. That's a good point. Take that.
No.
You didn't break Wes's heart, did you? That won't break your heart, will it?
Thanks for coming and thanks for all your help. So of course. Appreciate that.
As in the current ordinances, the Planning Commission evaluates development plans and subdivision plats as well as providing a recommendation to the City Council on zoning amendments. Like in the existing ordinances, the Planning Commission is also charged with considering waivers to zoning and subdivision regulations. Regarding new powers and duties, the Planning Commission is permitted to evaluate applications for an alternative equivalency. An alternative equivalency is a request which is made by an applicant who wishes to in some way meet the standards in the UDO, but in a way that was unanticipated by the UDO. And we talked back in the summer that might be, for example, about screening. The UDO says you have to have a screening yard that is X feet wide. But the applicant comes forward to the Planning Commission and says, for example, due to the topography between these two lots, that is not going to make sense. That is not going to work. So I'm going to propose an alternative method. So an equivalency is not a deviation, it's not a waiver, it's not a variance, it's just another way to meet the standard that was not anticipated by the UDO, but works in that particular circumstances. The UDO also expresses that the Planning Commission prepares comprehensive and land use plans. This power is actually given by KRS 100-183, and it is now listed in the UDO.
So they already have that.
They do already have
Bringing
it,
it to life.
just showing it in the
What was the
UDO.
other one that, I'm sorry, I was kind of trying to read?
That's okay.
Consideration of alternative equivalency. Can you explain that one more time to me? I'm sorry.
That's okay. So it's a situation where the applicant says, I want to meet the standard. I'm just going to meet it in a way that was not anticipated in the UDO. So for example, the screening example. But it's not a variance, it's not a waiver. It just simply says, because of, for example, the topography in this area, I want to meet the screening standard or the buffer yard standard this way. Screening meaning like trees or walls or fences or those kinds of things. And so the applicant comes forward and says, I know the ordinance says this, but for these reasons, I want to meet the intent of that requirement this way. And then the Planning Commission can evaluate that and say, yes, in this circumstances, it makes sense. They will make findings by which to do so, and then they will grant it. But it's not a waiver, it's not a variance, it's just another way for the applicant to meet the standard that the UDO does not anticipate.
How did they meet the standard before that it has a different board or something?
So the interesting thing about Kentucky law is that the only thing the Board of Adjustment can give a variance to is a number. So for example, if the buffer yard needs to be 10 feet and they only want to provide 8, the Board of Adjustment can grant that variance. However, they can't grant a variance to the number, to the type of trees, or the fact that it's that we're going to do a different type of fence than is anticipated by the ordinance. That is something the Board of Adjustment cannot give a variance to by Kentucky revised statute. Again, that is something that is tied, our hands are tied in that respect. So in this situation, so for example, if the applicant says, instead of providing X number of trees and Y fence, I want to do this. There's a whole new type, brand new type of fencing that's made out of this material and it's going to provide this much better screening, and this is what I'm proposing in this situation. The Planning Commission could evaluate that and say, yes, you're right. In this situation, because of those materials, that screening makes sense. They would be given an alternative equivalency.
In the UDO, if they do that, if there's some equivalency allowance, it says something about, I think, providing a written finding.
Yes.
What is that? Who does that go to?
So the Planning Commission has to make those findings. So you will notice in the ordinance that there are review criteria by which the Planning Commission, all of this, unlike your current ordinance, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, we move to the next screen. You know, we are providing them standards by which to review it, and they have to make certain findings. So it's not just simply a situation, the applicant comes forward, the Planning Commission says, yeah, that looks good. They actually have a process by which to evaluate it and standards and criteria by which to evaluate it, if that makes sense.
And they have to document that.
And they have to document all of that. It all has to be in the minutes. As this chart indicates, the Planning Commission currently has the authority to grant waivers, including the maximum height, a waiver to the maximum height in the professional office district. you will notice on the right-hand side, several extra waiver authorities are included in the UDO, but in almost every situation, these are for regulations that aren't currently in your zoning ordinance, such as the amount of on-site parking that is required when off-site parking is utilized. That's a place where the planning commission can give a waiver. However, your current ordinance is silent on that. As I've said, the existing zoning ordinance permits waivers, but does not provide a process for granting them. The UDO includes a process that includes findings by the planning commission that they have to make when they grant a waiver. So again, this is giving them a thought process by which to consider whether or not, in this particular instance, the waiver is appropriate, which you don't currently have. So you will notice that the planning commission has already a good number of instances currently in the zoning ordinance where they can grant waivers. Currently, the Board of...
Can you go back to that one real quick? I was reading those last four.
I'm sorry.
These are new ones right here, right?
Right.
Did you go over these, and did I miss that? Because I was just reading when you were going over them.
Yeah, so for the last three, all of those are standards in the ordinance that are new in the UDO. So the reason the planning commission does not have that authority today is because the existing zoning ordinance doesn't regulate it. The fourth one from the bottom, development standards for building and parking setbacks in non-residential districts, is granted in the UDO, but it's also granted in some situations in the existing zoning ordinance. So for example, they can reduce the rear setback in the central business district under the existing zoning ordinance. They can, in the professional office district under your existing ordinance, give a waiver to the maximum height. Does that make sense? So in some situations, we are replicating what they currently have. In some situations, we are actually taking it away. There is no place in the UDO where the planning commission can grant a waiver to maximum height. Now, having said that, an applicant can always go to the Board of Adjustment and request a variance because it's a number and they are allowed by Kentucky Revised Statutes for the BOA to grant a variance to maximum height.
So a couple of these I'm not comfortable with, and I hope to get comfortable with, but we reduced the amount of lot size, where we like, you know, 60% of the lot, right, for the building. What we said, well, was it, you can't use the whole lot to build, it's 65% in some of the towns. And then you have this development standards building and parking setbacks. So, and then you have amount of on-site parking when some parking is provided off-site. So it kind of negates our restrictions because we put that in place instead of having a parking to suit that. You're saying, hey, you can build this and use someone else's parking lot. So
today, in your current ordinance, you have the provision for off-site parking.
Okay.
So for example, you have a use in Midway that cannot provide all of, and I'm just making this up. You have a new use that cannot provide parking on site that's needed. So therefore, they say to the dentist office down the street, I'm going to use your parking lot after hours. You have that current provision. That provision is currently replicated in the UDO. But what we have added in the UDO is saying that if you are using off-site parking, you have to provide a certain amount of it on-site. So that is a change. So you're saying if you use it, you still have to provide some on-site. What this does is give the Planning Commission a waiver to that on-site requirement. Does that make sense? I know that's slightly confusing, but
it just sounds like it's a way around some of the restrictions we made.
Having been on planning commission, I can say that if you don't allow a decent amount of waivers, you really absolutely will handcuff them to the point where it's difficult to do their job. Waivers sound like a bad thing. Sometimes they're absolutely necessary.
I'm not.
And they're very judicious about how they use them.
so again, I would point out that your existing code does it. It's very common in Kentucky due to the limitations by the Kentucky Revised Statutes. And we are providing the UDO provides for a definitive process by which waivers are considered. There are application requirements. The applicant has to demonstrate that the waiver will not adversely affect property owners, for example, that it doesn't violate the comprehensive plan, that the extent of the waiver is only to the extent necessary, and that the applicant, for example, has incorporated design measures that exceed the minimums or compensate in some way for it, or the strict application of provisions and regulations would deprive the applicant of the reasonable use of their property.
So all that is defining what that is right there.
So all of this is telling the planning commission how to act, which your current ordinance doesn't do. So you have waivers, but it gives the planning commission, your current ordinance doesn't give the planning commission any process, any procedure to evaluate those waivers. And so what this does is do that. And then it goes through and says the planning commission has to make certain findings. And then to Councilmember Strange's comment, you have to provide all of those findings in writing in your minutes so that everything is documented as to why you made the decision.
So it's these types of things that, this section I'm just torn with, only just because you just took one sentence and put a page of definitions behind it that I don't have. So it makes it tougher for me to push forward on these boundaries that you've opened up for some of our boards and committees without a further review in my mind. You know what I mean? I'm trying to trust everything, the process here, but you just read off a lot of things based on one sentence, so I just want to get a better understanding. This is something that I want to go through all this, of course, but it might be something I don't know how everybody else feels, but I'd like to sit down and understand each line and the powers we're given to each committee and each board and every individual at the city to make sure that I'm comfortable with it and it doesn't negate or take away from some of the parameters we set, you know what I mean? So where offsets the restrictions we made. And it makes me nervous because we did those for a reason, for density and intensity, and I just don't want to give up that either, you know what I mean? So, but I do think there's things that they can do that we're wasting a lot of time and energy and money on to try to get to the bottom of, so. But that's exactly what I had no idea.
Are you saying like, so for each of these new lines, let's dig a little deeper and see what this is?
I wouldn't mind. I mean, we have 45 minutes left, and I just think that if we broke it down into committees, okay, what are adjustments getting? What is Kevin getting? What is the planning and zoning getting? What is the design review board getting? And broke it down individually, and then it might be a little easier for me to comprehend.
So this is the planning commission, and then we'll move forward and do precisely that for all the rest of them if you would like me to do that.
Yeah, that's what I would like personally. So, just like, anybody else have any comments on this?
Okay. So for the Board of Adjustment, they currently hear appeals from administrative decisions, as Kevin was referencing. They hear and decide upon zoning variances and conditional use permits. That's in your current ordinance. And the zoning ordinance, the board also considers changes to non-conforming uses. All of that is currently in your ordinance and will be replicated in the UDO.
Just to stop you for 1 second. So right now, the Board of Adjustment hears the recommendation from the other boards, but they're the only group that actually makes the decision on approving or not approving a waiver or a, is that right or not right?
So they are the only board that can approve a variance.
Right now.
Correct. But again, and the way a waiver works, and maybe I should have said this on the other screen, is you have to expressly state within the ordinance what standard can be waived. And so that's what the UDO does. It says, in this particular instance, this standard can be waived. And those powers are given, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, to the Planning Commission. In the case of the Board of Adjustment, any number standard within the UDO, just like in your zoning ordinance, can go to the Board of Adjustment and they can request a variance. And that is in your current ordinance, it's in the Kentucky Revised Statutes, and it's in the UDO. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, right. So essentially when I say a number, I mean a setback, a height, a number of parking spaces. Any of those numbers, an applicant can always request a variance.
And that's how it is in the new.
And that's how it is in the new. Again, because the Kentucky Revised Statute says it defines what a variance is, and it defines who can hear them and decide upon them. You have no ability to deviate from that.
But we can say they can only give a numerical variance up to a certain point.
No. You cannot.
So on the building height that we put in the UDO that's 40 feet, like Kevin can go 5% higher, right?
Correct.
They could go to the Board of Adjustments and say we want another 10
Correct.
or 50.
Or 50.
Per state rule.
Per state rule.
This is a state thing. We can't say, no, you can't do that. It's a state, KRS regulates that.
They have the right to ask, but the Board of Adjustment does not have to grant.
That's
Correct.
correct. Because again, the Board of Adjustment has standards by which they evaluate variances. They can always have the right to ask. The Board of Adjustment always has the right to say no.
Yeah, Mike, I was just making sure I understood it correctly, that they could or not. I didn't get it.
Would the Board of Adjustment try to stay within the guidelines of what we have now? They're probably going to.
Absolutely. And the Board of Adjustment is going to evaluate why they're asking for it and what the extenuating circumstance is. And they're going to be looking at, listen to the words I'm about to say. Are we depriving the property owner of any usable value for their property? Because, and Tim can, chime in at any point here, we as a city, you as a city, have a responsibility to allow every person who owns a piece of property within your community the right to use it within a certain set of boundaries. And so what the applicant is doing is going to the Board of Adjustment and saying, you're depriving me of the use of my property, here's why, and here's the remedy. And we have to do that. The Kentucky Supreme Court has actually said about variances that they are the safety valve for zoning ordinances. I mean, that was stated by the Supreme Court because that is what a variance is. It is a safety valve.
In 100%. In the 5% that Eric was talking about is an unintentional piece. Not necessarily, I want to build it this way, can I get a 5% variance to do it? 5% difference in height than what's in the UDO, it's got to be unintentional.
Correct, but again, and I hate to be pedantic, so I apologize. But let's keep in our heads things that are separate. There are waivers and there are modifications, which is what the zoning administrator can do, 5% for height. But then there are variances. And the reason I'm being overly pedantic about that is because the variances are governed by the Kentucky Revised Statutes. And we don't have any ability to deviate how much they can vary, who hears it, any of those things. We have to.
Pedantic for me?
Too detail oriented. Being a pain about the details.
Put that on the slide. Any words you're going to throw in there, the slide in the beginning so we know.
So again, I apologize for that, but I mean, we have to, and I know it's a difficult thing to do when we're talking about these things, but separating your mind, if we're talking about the Board of Adjustment, in this particular circumstances, we are talking about variances. Now, I'm going to muddy the water a little bit.
Just now?
Just now.
I can see the bottom there for a second.
Yeah. So I said that the Board of Adjustment hears all conditional uses. Again, that is something that's set by KRS. We have no ability to change that. And a conditional use, if you remember, is a use that's listed as conditional in each district. Now, the thing that's new to the UDO is section 5.4, which is about 75 pages, that for every conditional use, we have laid out both objective and subjective standards by which the Board of Adjustment reviews them. So right now, you have conditional uses. But again, the zoning ordinance does not tell the Board of Adjustment how to evaluate them. And so what that section does is gives all of the standards by which the Board of Adjustment looks at them. And some of them are very objective, saying you have to have a minimum lot area of X that is bigger than the minimum lot area in the district. Or it may say something like this: you have to demonstrate that you will have no adverse impact on your neighboring property. Therefore, that is something the Board of Adjustment will then look at for that particular use. Keep in mind that the Board of Adjustment is a quasi-judicial board, and they are used to dealing with both variances and conditional uses in that quasi-judicial role, which is why they have those subjective kinds of standards as opposed to the objective ones. Now, here I go muddying it. In those standards, let's just say, for example, the minimum lot area. We say the minimum lot area has to be 43,560 square feet for a gas station. And I don't know if that's what I said, I'm just giving you an example. And that's 1 acre, in case you don't know. However, the person who wants to put the gas station has 42,900 square feet. Well, that's 500 square feet less than what's in an acre. What the only new power that the Board of Adjustment has is they would be able to grant a waiver to that requirement, for example. So in that situation, they're wearing a waiver hat versus a variance hat. Does that make sense? Okay.
How much can they waiver that?
There is no limitation on it.
Can somebody, if to money it even more with the appeal process? So if somebody appeals a decision from the Board of Adjustment, it goes to the circuit court, I believe. And now, if they appeal the design review board, it now comes to the city council.
Correct.
And that's only to appeal the Board of Adjustment or design review board's denial, correct?
Correct.
So what if I have a piece of property and the Board of Adjustment or Design Review Board give a variance to the property next door to me and I want to appeal it? Can that happen?
So, but again, keep in mind, we're talking about variances or waivers. And so for variances, the answer is no. And for waivers, the answer is no. Tim?
I agree.
Yep.
So maybe I misunderstood. So we can grant those waivers per KRS statute.
They can grant variances by KRS statute.
The waivers are something we're adding in our UDO for them to have.
Correct. Only for those standards that are for conditional uses that are listed in the UDO.
So the conditional uses, but didn't we lessen the verbiage on them so that it was more open for interpretation?
No.
Okay. You're talking like a salon, gas station, that's the conditional uses, right? Is that what you mean by that?
Every zoning district, every conventional district, so R1, R3, all of those have conditional uses. And I say conventional because we're not talking about overlay here, we're talking about those underlying districts have conditional uses. And the reason I said that no so definitively is because today, most of your conditional uses aren't defined. We have now defined them. There are no standards for your conditional uses. So the planning commission, the Board of Adjustment just evaluates them. What we have done is name them, define them, and given them 100 pages worth of standards by which to evaluate every conditional use. So in that sense, we have actually tied their hands. We have taken away their powers because we have defined the uses and we have given them standards.
Could we make it where if they, this makes me uncomfortable, giving them waivers that can alter things of this nature, this strength. If they were to waiver them, could it then come back to the council for approval?
Are you talking specifically for the Board of Adjustment?
Yes. Right now,
Statutory, that goes to circuit court.
Well, we're talking about waivers, not variances.
Oh, gotcha, okay.
Sorry. So you have the authority, I mean, you certainly could say, any waiver requested from a conditional use either comes to you or you have veto authority, but that's going to add to your agenda, to be honest with you.
that's fine. That's what we signed up for. How does anybody, that's a lot of power, you know what I mean? So I like the checks and balances system. The one of the reasons I like this is all these boards are appointed, we're elected. So sometimes I think it's better for the elected people to fall on the sword.
But I would ask you before you make that decision, all of you, to actually look at section 5.4. And think about what you're doing, because those, again, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. And if this is a decision policy you want to make, that's yours. And I'll support it and I'll write it all day long. But again, the uses are defined, you have those standards, and we've now done that.
And I might be for it. Right now, just it's not like I am. That's one of those things I thought about earlier. I haven't looked at 5.4. I just looked at this piece of paper that you sent out, you know what I mean? So to look at all these things, I don't know if it was in here, maybe I overlooked it. I looked at this 6 pages that you sent, and it doesn't really define, or point, maybe it does point back to it. But I don't know, I may need more reinforcement on an individual basis for what each one is. That's a lot.
The only thing I would say, this UDO is so much stronger and tighter and better. The Board of Adjustments, we just had a hearing the other day, it's quasi judicial, may very well result in now going to circuit court, and they didn't have this ordinance to rely upon to take away all the standards recommended and suggested. But you gotta do what you gotta do.
All right, anyway, before we move on to the design review board. So again, let's keep in mind the design review board wears 2 hats. They wear the historical hat, which is all the certificate of appropriateness, which is in downtown and Midway. And then now, as we talked about tonight, Tower Park. So they retain their existing duties to review the exterior alterations in the Central Business District and the homes on Alexander Circle and Cochran Avenue. And again, these duties reside in Chapter 36, as we talked about previously. And then they will get the homes in Tower Park. Now, let's go to the next hat. Under the UDO, the DRB will provide recommendations to the Planning Commission when a development is proposed in the business and the mixed-use districts. So now we are no longer talking about historic review. We're talking about design review. They're called the Design Review Board to provide design review. Now, as I've said, reviewing projects outside the Central Business District will be very different and new for the Design Review Board. In instances when a development plan is not required in the business and the mixed-use districts, the DRB will evaluate and act on those applications. So let's say, for example, US Bank. They want to reclad the building, and that's a bad example because that's downtown. The engineering building on Alexander Pike. They want to convert it back to a retail space. But they're not going to add any square footage, they're not going to change the parking. And the reason I use those terms is because those things would force it in front of the Planning Commission. But all they want to do is change it back to a retail space and put in all those new windows in the front and all of those things. Those are exterior modifications that are designed. That would go to the Design Review Board for them to act upon, and that's new. And then the Design Review Board would then act on deviations or modifications to the residential contextual standards that are in the R1 and the R2 districts. And then potentially, if you decide to use the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay district, they would also act upon deviations from those. So for example, someone actually wanted to put a metal carport that was not behind it. They could go to the Design Review Board and ask, for example. All right, continue discussion.
I think it's important to realize that what is going to propose here is amazingly more restrictive than what we have now. And I think we're kind of losing sight of that. That 100 pages that we talked about of guidelines for our volunteer boards to go through puts a lot more direction for them to make decisions. But right now, they're just making decisions based on the information they have and their experience, and they all have great experience in this area. One of the concerns that I had from the very beginning is the more restrictive we get, the more chances we have of having lawsuits against us because of being too restrictive. Bottom line is we all have to remember, the property owner has a right to develop their property. There's only so much that we can, as a city, can do to restrict that right to develop the property. Well, we put a lot of restrictions on this. I'm fine with it, and I think it's been a great review. We've got a lot of great new things in here, so I would encourage us to go ahead and do the first reading tonight, and then the changes that we recommended tonight will be changed for the second reading, so that we can move forward. In those areas we pulled out, we can review those more. I think everybody's done an awesome job on this, and all the public input we've had, I think, has been so helpful. So I appreciate everything you all have done in getting us through this.
What does it, can you comment on this 6-page document that came out with the different, you know, what I'm talking about?
Yes, sir.
Under our section Board of Council, it says that we hear and act upon appeals from the design review board's decisions on exemptions, exceptions, and modifications from the requirements. What does that mean exactly?
So, 6 or 8 months ago, y'all changed the ordinance for your certificate of appropriateness, that instead of appeals from the design review board for certificate of appropriateness going to court directly, they came to you. And then, so we met back in the summer, you said, I want the same thing to happen here. So for example, in that situation, so someone requests a modification or a deviation from the design standards along Alexandria Pike, instead of going to court, they would come here. And so I changed the ordinance to make that, so that it would come here.
So does that apply to these last two on the right-hand side where the design review board is evaluating, deciding upon deviations from design-related regulations?
Correct, yes.
Any of the?
So if they deny one, they would have the ability to come to you prior to going to court.
Okay, so we're not looking, if they grant it, it doesn't count.
Correct, correct.
It would be if they denied something, a property owner comes and they deny, the property gets denied, and the property owner wants to appeal it, rather than go to court, they come to us. So I think that was a good thing to put in there. Gives us an opportunity to take a look at what's going on rather than going straight to court.
And it makes it parallel, right? Anytime the design review board acts, they come here.
Right.
If there's a denial.
Just to talk a little bit about, on the agenda, we were also going to talk about the site where West Banco is and behind it. One question I had, in a map that I have here, the front of the area where West Banco is, that is TCC, correct?
Correct.
And the back is TC1.
No, the back is towns that are supporting.
Yeah, okay, so with that in mind, can you talk a little bit about what kind of a building could potentially go in there as far as the footprint of the building on that whole site?
I'm happy to do that, but are there, as you can see, I've got slides. But is there any other discussion that we want to have about the duties of the boards and commissions?
I feel like I would like to, and I understand that, you know, we need to make sure that the design review board oversees the historical overlay we have, but I would like to break those out and do those individually for board and break it down to the sections, because I don't know if there was references in here, maybe I will look at it, as long as I'm looking at this stuff. I just am worried about that and the overreach or the waivers and not coming back. I don't know how Bell feels about it, but if you guys feel like you've got a good grasp on the powers we're giving them, or would you like to meet on those again and do them individually by board or committee or anybody?
I would just read through the documents. I read through all of it. I feel real comfortable with it. So
I want to continue looking at it, and I don't, unless I just don't remember, I don't remember that we had a lot of detailed meetings with planning and zoning about different areas that just talked about setbacks, building height, in that the actual physical zoning requirements, where we didn't really get into, and if we did at the beginning, maybe it didn't really sink in because we hadn't talked about that yet, or about the actual building further. Where we didn't quite get into the whole Article 1 in detail, which is what I think Adam's trying to say, is that to wrap our heads around it, I still want to, but so far, I'm okay. I just want to keep on looking at it. Does that make sense? I agree we can keep on looking at it.
I mean, I just would like to sit down, maybe one more meeting and go over those specifically. That's the one part it's the last piece of the puzzle that I'm still.
Adam, I think it's important to read the document before we have another meeting.
I think, does everybody understand? When she broke down 5.4, did everybody read 5.4? Okay.
I mean, we
Then
can,
also try to
well,
put
we,
it down to make me look like that. I'm just trying to get a better understanding for the people.
Well,
I don't think anybody here read 5.4. You know,
Why don't we documents?
Why would you do that? I'm trying to make it a better understanding for it. You try to call me out because if I didn't do my research, I do my homework. I'm sorry that I missed something, but I'm just trying to get a better understanding.
so we can definitely set up, a time for you or everybody to go over it again, like even if it's just a conference call or a video call.
So where we are right now is the planning and zoning sent this to us, and we have 90 days to either reject, accept, or modify, correct?
Correct.
So in those 90 days, we also have the holidays. So just to keep the ball moving, why couldn't we, like, I actually wouldn't mind or be opposed to doing a first reading, but also go ahead and set up a meeting in the next couple weeks to where we can really have a detailed talk about Article 1, which would put because this is a big document, and it's an important document that only happens every 10, 15 years, and it would certainly make all the council members that are voting on this feel better about voting on it, one way or the other.
Right, and so we could do that and just do like a conference call on video, that way at least doesn't have to be here. Then we can do 2 to 3 council members, so I can set up like 3 different times and just see who's available. Is that good? And then she can kind of just summarize what we're talking about. Does that?
And if we could get a document that was linked to the pages that we need to review for that, that would be fantastic.
Okay, yeah, we'll try, that's why we're doing a lot of these summaries, just because I know it's a lot to digest, and that's why at least we've been sending this out, so.
When does the 90-day window end?
I haven't counted it up. It's 90 days from October 16th.
Yeah, when they made their findings, which was October.
So January, mid-January.
Yeah, something like that.
So, to Andy's point, we could have first reading, and there can also be some minor changes in between first and second, as long as it's not substantive. And worst case scenario is we just have a special meeting and have another first reading of the new changes. So, I think that's definitely streamlines it. So, once we have that meeting, if everybody's comfortable, then we just move forward, and if they're not, then we can make some changes.
So if there's meeting, you can say like December, we can have a second first reading.
Correct. Yeah, we could pick up a day and, right, you would have maybe, I'm trying to think, I always like to vote down something before we do a second reading. But yeah, regardless, it would just be a new first reading of these changes and then have a second reading of that.
If we do a Zoom conference with like 3 and 3, like you said, can we come here and then can she set it up?
Sure.
So we can
Yeah, we can set up in the conference room.
In the conference room so we can see the slideshow as she's going through it.
Sure.
That would be.
Yeah, that's something that's difficult at your house or something.
I
we
just
can
would prefer it,
definitely-
because I would like the conversation with the people that are in that room, if everybody can meet, at least.
Yeah, we can do that downstairs in one of the conference rooms for sure.